In the heart of London, where history met modernity, Corporal James Harrington stood tall and proud outside Buckingham Palace. The grandeur of the palace loomed behind him, its golden gates gleaming under the morning sun. Tourists from all over the world gathered around, snapping photos and marveling at the iconic sight. Among them was James, a figure of discipline and dignity, dressed in the immaculate uniform of the Royal Guard. Red tunic, black trousers, and that unmistakable tall bearskin hat. James wasn't just another face in the ceremonial lineup. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that set him apart. His posture was perfect, his movements precise, and his expression calm yet alert. People often stopped to admire him, some even asking if they could take pictures with him. Though protocol restricted interaction during duty hours, James would occasionally nod or give a small smile before resuming his vigilant stance. He knew how important it was to represent not only himself, but also the institution he served. What many didn't realize was that James's journey to this position hadn't been easy. Born to a British mother and an African father, he grew up navigating two worlds. As a child, he faced taunts and insults because of his mixed heritage. Some kids called him names, while others excluded him from games. But James never let their words break him. Instead, he channeled his energy into becoming stronger, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. He joined cadet programs as a teenager, excelling in drills and leadership activities. By the time he applied to join the Royal Guards, he had already developed a reputation for resilience and determination. Now, standing guard outside one of the most famous landmarks in the world, James felt a deep sense of pride. Every day, he reminded himself why he chose this path: to serve, to protect, and to inspire. Still, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Occasionally, someone in the crowd would mutter something derogatory about his skin color or question whether someone like him belonged in such a prestigious role. These moments stung, but James refused to let them show. He believed in leading by example, proving through his actions that character mattered more than appearance. On this particular morning, the air buzzed with excitement. Families posed for pictures, couples held hands as they admired the palace, and children pointed excitedly at the guards. James scanned the area, his eyes sharp and attentive. He noticed a group of schoolchildren giggling as they mimicked the guards' stiff posture. A corner of his mouth twitched upward, almost a smile, but he quickly composed himself. Discipline came first. As the hours passed, the flow of visitors ebbed and flowed. Some were respectful, whispering quietly as they observed the changing of the guard ceremony. Others were rowdier, shouting jokes or trying to distract the soldiers. Through it all, James remained steadfast, his focus unshaken. Little did he know, however, that today would bring a challenge unlike any he'd faced before. Somewhere in the bustling crowd, trouble was brewing, a man with anger in his eyes and hatred in his heart. And soon, James would find himself tested in ways he couldn't have imagined. Amidst the lively atmosphere of the palace square, a man approached the gates with an air of arrogance that immediately drew attention. His name was Reginald Hargrove, a figure well known in certain circles for his loud opinions and confrontational demeanor. With his unkempt hair, rumpled clothes, and a scowl etched deeply into his face, Reginald looked out of place among the cheerful tourists, snapping photos and admiring the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. At his side trotted a large German shepherd, its muscles rippling beneath sleek black and tan fur. The dog's sharp eyes scanned the crowd as if ready to pounce at any moment. Reginald had spent the morning drinking at a nearby pub, nursing grievances both real and imagined. By the time he decided to head toward the palace, his mood was sour, fueled by bitterness and misplaced anger. To him, the sight of Corporal James Harrington standing tall outside the gates became an instant provocation. Here was someone who, in Reginald's twisted worldview, didn't belong in this role, a person of mixed heritage guarding something he deemed purely British. It wasn't the first time Reginald had let such thoughts consume him, but today he seemed determined to act on them. As he neared the gate, Reginald's voice cut through the hum of conversation like a knife. "Oi, you there?" he barked, pointing directly at James. Heads turned as people realized the commotion was aimed at one of the guards. Some stepped back instinctively, sensing trouble brewing. Others paused, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch what unfolded. Ignoring the growing tension around him, Reginald sneered openly at James, his words dripping with venom. "What are you doing here? Standing guard like you own the place. This isn't your country." The crowd fell silent, their collective unease palpable. Parents pulled their children closer, while others exchanged worried glances. James, however, remained still as a statue, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He'd heard insults like these before, though rarely so publicly. His training kicked in. He knew better than to react emotionally. But that didn't mean the words didn't sting. Beneath his calm exterior, James felt a flicker of frustration, not because of the insult itself, but because it disrupted the harmony of the space he worked so hard to protect. Reginald, emboldened by the lack of response, grew louder. "Look at you," he spat, pacing back and forth in front of the gate. "You think wearing that fancy uniform makes you special? You're nothing but a joke." His tone carried a mix of mockery and rage, drawing even more onlookers. Foams began to appear, held aloft to capture whatever might happen next. A few brave souls tried to reason with Reginald, urging him to calm down, but he brushed them off with sharp retorts. Then, almost casually, Reginald reached down and unclipped the leash from his dog's collar. The German shepherd, sensing its master's agitation, tensed up, its ears perking forward. The gesture sent a ripple of alarm through the crowd. Someone gasped audibly, while another shouted, "Hey, don't do anything stupid." But Reginald ignored them all, his focus entirely on James. His lips curled into a cruel smile as he gave the command under his breath. "Go get him." For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The dog hesitated, looking between Reginald and James as if weighing its options. Then, with a low growl, it lunged forward, teeth bared and muscles coiled like springs. The crowd erupted into chaos. Screams filled the air as people scrambled out of the way. Children clung to their parents, and some visitors ducked behind barriers, hearts pounding. All eyes were now on James, waiting to see how he would respond to this sudden and terrifying threat barreling toward him. As the German shepherd lunged forward with a ferocious snarl, time seemed to slow down for everyone watching. The massive dog moved like a blur, its powerful legs propelling it toward James with terrifying speed. Its teeth gleamed in the sunlight, and its deep growl echoed through the square, sending shivers down the spines of those who witnessed the scene. For most people, the instinct would have been to panic, to raise their arms in defense, shout for help, or even try to run. But James Harrington wasn't most people. Without hesitation, James dropped to one knee, lowering himself to the dog's level. His movements were deliberate and calm, betraying no trace of fear despite the imminent danger. Instead of flinching or retreating, he extended his open palm toward the charging animal, keeping his body relaxed and his breathing steady. To the onlookers, this reaction seemed almost surreal. How could someone face such a threat without showing any sign of alarm? Yet there was something deeply reassuring about James's composure, a quiet confidence that made the chaos around him feel less overwhelming. The crowd held its collective breath as the dog skidded to a halt just inches away from James. Its ears twitched and its head tilted slightly, confusion replacing aggression. The fierce snarls softened into low whimpers as the dog sniffed James's outstretched hand. It was as if the animal sensed that James posed no threat. In fact, quite the opposite. Slowly, almost cautiously, the German shepherd sat down at James's feet, its tail thumping lightly against the ground. The transformation was astonishing. What had started as a violent attack ended with the dog sitting obediently beside James, looking up at him with trusting eyes. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some spectators clapped their hands over their mouths in disbelief, while others whispered excitedly to one another. Phones continued to record the scene, capturing every detail of this unexpected turn of events. Even Reginald Hargrove, still standing nearby, appeared momentarily stunned. His jaw hung open, and his face flushed red, not just from embarrassment, but also from mounting frustration. He had expected chaos, humiliation for James, perhaps even retaliation. Instead, he found himself facing an outcome he couldn't have anticipated: his own dog choosing to side with the very person he'd tried to harm. James remained perfectly still, maintaining eye contact with the dog, and speaking softly under his breath. Though no one could hear what he said, the gentle tone of his voice carried a sense of reassurance, not just to the animal but to the frightened crowd as well. This wasn't luck. It was skill born of experience. Growing up, James had spent countless hours around dogs, learning how to read their body language and understand their behavior. He knew that animals often reacted more to energy than words, and his calm demeanor had disarmed the dog far more effectively than any physical action could have. For a moment, the square fell eerily silent, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional click of camera shutters. Then, slowly, murmurs of admiration began to rise from the crowd. "Did you see that?" one woman exclaimed, her voice trembling with awe. "He didn't even flinch." Another man shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "Incredible, absolutely incredible." Even the skeptics who might have doubted James's ability to handle the situation were now nodding in respect, their expressions a mix of relief and amazement. But the tension wasn't over yet. Reginald, realizing he'd lost control of both the situation and his dog, clenched his fists tightly. His face twisted with rage as he took a step closer, clearly unwilling to let the moment pass without further confrontation. The crowd braced themselves, unsure of what he might do next. Would he lash out again, or would he finally realize the futility of his actions? Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: Corporal James Harrington had already proven himself not just as a protector, but as someone capable of turning hostility into harmony, one calm gesture at a time. As the tension between James Harrington and Reginald Hargrove reached its boiling point, the arrival of police officers brought a new dynamic to the scene. Two uniformed officers pushed their way through the crowd, their presence immediately commanding attention. The murmurs of onlookers quieted as everyone turned to watch what would happen next. Reginald, still gripping the leash tightly, seemed momentarily unsure of how to proceed. His face flushed even redder, whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell, but he continued shouting, his voice now directed at the officers instead of James. "This is ridiculous," Reginald barked, pointing an accusing finger at James. "He's the one who provoked my dog. I didn't do anything wrong." His tone was defensive, almost desperate, as if trying to convince not just the officers, but also himself that he was in the right. But his words fell flat. The crowd, which had witnessed the entire incident unfold, began shaking their heads and muttering under their breath. Several people stepped forward voluntarily, eager to share their accounts with the authorities. One woman held up her phone, showing footage she had recorded of Reginald unleashing the dog and shouting insults. Another man chimed in, saying loudly, "We all saw what happened. That poor guard did nothing but stay calm while this guy lost his mind." The officers listened intently, nodding as they gathered information. They exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the severity of the situation. While James remained silent, standing tall and composed, Reginald grew increasingly agitated. He paced back and forth, tugging at the leash as the German shepherd whimpered softly, still reluctant to leave James's side. It was a surreal sight. The same dog that had been set loose in an act of aggression, now clinging to the very person it had been ordered to attack. To many observers, this spoke volumes about James's character and the respect he commanded, not just from people, but even from animals. One of the officers approached Reginald, speaking firmly but calmly. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us," he said, gesturing toward the patrol car parked nearby. Reginald sputtered in protest, insisting that he hadn't done anything illegal. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses were lining up to testify, and the videos being shared on social media painted a damning picture of his behavior. When the second officer gently took hold of his arm, guiding him toward the vehicle, Reginald finally snapped. "You're making a mistake," he yelled, struggling briefly before realizing resistance was futile. As he was led away, he shot one last venomous glare at James, muttering under his breath, "This isn't over." Meanwhile, the crowd erupted into applause. Strangers patted James on the shoulder, offering words of encouragement and admiration. Some called him a hero, while others simply thanked him for handling the situation with such grace. A young boy holding his mother's hand looked up at James with wide-eyed wonder, asking innocently, "Are you Superman?" The question drew laughter from those nearby, breaking the lingering tension. James smiled faintly, crouching down to meet the child's gaze. "No, I'm just someone doing my job," he replied kindly. "But thank you for the kind words." As the commotion died down and the crowd began to disperse, James returned to his post, resuming his vigilant stance as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet beneath his calm exterior, there was a sense of quiet satisfaction, not because he had won the confrontation, but because he had stayed true to his values. He knew that moments like these were bigger than him. They were opportunities to show the world that dignity and compassion could triumph over hatred and ignorance. The aftermath of the incident left a lasting impression on everyone present. For some, it reinforced their belief in humanity's capacity for goodness. For others, it served as a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice and unchecked anger. And for James, it was another chapter in his journey, a testament to the power of patience, discipline, and unwavering resolve. Though the day's events would soon fade into memory for most, the lessons learned would linger far longer, inspiring countless conversations about courage, empathy, and the choices we make when faced with adversity. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Buckingham Palace, news of the incident had spread far beyond the square. Social media platforms buzzed with activity as videos and photos of the confrontation went viral. The hashtag #GuardianWithGrace began trending within hours, accompanied by captions praising James Harrington's composure and humanity. Clips showing him calmly diffusing the situation with the German Shepherd were viewed millions of times, while screenshots of Reginald Hargrove's aggressive behavior sparked outrage worldwide. Comments poured in from people of all walks of life, some expressing admiration for James, others condemning Reginald's actions, and many reflecting on the broader lessons about tolerance and resilience. The next morning, newspapers carried headlines celebrating James's heroism. "Royal Guard turns hatred into harmony," read one prominent article, accompanied by a striking image of James kneeling beside the dog. Another publication described him as a symbol of dignity in an era of division. Journalists clamored to speak with witnesses, piecing together the story from every angle. Even international outlets picked up the tale, highlighting how a single act of calmness could inspire so many. For James, however, the sudden fame was both humbling and overwhelming. He woke up that day knowing his life, and perhaps his career, had changed forever. At the palace barracks, James's fellow guards greeted him with pride and respect. Some slapped him lightly on the back, grinning as they joked about his newfound celebrity status. Others simply nodded solemnly, acknowledging the weight of what he had endured. His commanding officer called him into a private meeting, not to reprimand him but to commend him for upholding the values of the regiment under extraordinary circumstances. "You've made us proud, Corporal Harrington," the officer said, shaking James's hand firmly. "Your actions remind us why we stand guard, not just to protect, but to inspire." Later that afternoon, James received a message that left him deeply moved, a personal note of gratitude from a member of the royal family. In it, they expressed their appreciation for his professionalism and courage, noting that he embodied the spirit of service and integrity expected of those who wore the uniform. The gesture meant more to James than any medal or public recognition ever could. It validated years of hard work and sacrifice, proving that staying true to oneself could leave a lasting impact. Despite the outpouring of support, James remained humble. When reporters arrived at the palace gates hoping for an interview, he politely declined, explaining that he preferred to let his actions speak for themselves. Instead, he focused on his duties, standing tall outside the palace, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet everywhere he went, people recognized him. Tourists approached him cautiously, asking if they could take pictures or shake his hand. Children handed him drawings of soldiers and dogs, their faces beaming with admiration. Each interaction reminded James of the ripple effect of kindness. Even something as simple as remaining calm in the face of hostility could touch countless lives. Meanwhile, Reginald Hargrove faced mounting consequences for his actions. News outlets identified him as the man behind the incident, and his name became synonymous with intolerance and poor judgment. Legal proceedings began swiftly, with charges filed for inciting violence and endangering public safety. During court appearances, Reginald appeared visibly shaken, his earlier bravado replaced by shame and regret. While some argued that his punishment should fit the severity of his actions, others hoped he might use this experience as an opportunity to reflect and grow. Mandatory anger management classes and community service were part of his sentence, a chance, perhaps, to confront the biases that had driven him to such extremes. For James, the entire episode served as a powerful reminder of the importance of leading by example. Every insult hurled at him, every hateful word spoken by Reginald, had been met not with retaliation but with patience and understanding. And in doing so, James hadn't just diffused a dangerous situation. He had ignited a global conversation about grace under pressure and the transformative power of compassion. As he stood once again outside the palace gates, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he felt a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just his job, it was his calling: to protect, to serve, and to inspire, no matter the challenges he faced. Reginald Hargrove's face burned with a mix of anger and humiliation as he stared at the scene unfolding before him. His dog, the same animal he had unleashed with malicious intent, now sat peacefully at James Harrington's side, wagging its tail as if it had found a new best friend. The contrast between Reginald's fury and James's calm demeanor couldn't have been more striking. While Reginald seethed, clenching his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white, James remained composed, his expression unreadable but firm. For a moment, Reginald stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. He glanced around at the crowd, hoping for some sign of support or validation, but instead, he was met with disapproving stares. Parents shielded their children from his sight, while others whispered harsh words about his behavior. Even those who hadn't spoken up earlier were shaking their heads in disgust. The weight of public judgment pressed down on him, but rather than backing off, it only fueled his rage further. Finally, unable to contain himself, Reginald lunged forward, reaching for the dog's leash. "Come here, you useless mutt," he barked, yanking hard on the leather strap. But the dog didn't budge. Instead, it let out a low whine and leaned closer to James, clearly reluctant to leave the man who had shown it kindness in the face of aggression. This small act of defiance infuriated Reginald even more. He tugged harder, shouting obscenities not just at the dog, but also at James. "This is your fault." He spat, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" James finally broke his silence. Rising slowly to his full height, he squared his shoulders and looked Reginald directly in the eye. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet authority that commanded respect. "Sir," he said in a firm but measured tone, "your dog is safe, and so am I. Let's not make this worse." His words carried a weight that silenced the surrounding chatter. Even Reginald paused mid-tirade, taken aback by the calmness in James's voice. The simplicity of James's response struck a chord with the onlookers. In a situation where most would have retaliated or lost their temper, James chose reason over reaction. He didn't raise his voice. insult Reginald, or escalate the confrontation. Instead, he addressed the man respectfully, acknowledging the tension without adding fuel to the fire. It was a masterclass in self-control, a reminder that true strength lies not in dominance but in restraint. Reginald, however, wasn't ready to back down. Still gripping the leash tightly, he jabbed a finger at James, his face contorted with rage. "Don't tell me what to do," he snapped. "You're nothing but a glorified statue. You shouldn't even be here." His words echoed through the square, drawing gasps from the crowd. A few brave individuals stepped forward, urging Reginald to stop before things got out of hand. One elderly man, leaning heavily on his cane, spoke up firmly. "Leave the lad alone. He hasn't done anything wrong." Despite the growing pressure, James maintained his composure. He adjusted his stance slightly, ensuring he remained alert but non-threatening. His training had prepared him for situations like this, not just physically, but mentally. He understood that responding to hatred with hatred would only perpetuate the cycle. By staying calm, he wasn't just protecting himself, he was setting an example for everyone watching. As the standoff continued, the atmosphere grew tense. Some in the crowd began recording videos, capturing both the escalating aggression of Reginald and the unwavering poise of James. Social media platforms would soon be flooded with clips of the incident, highlighting the stark difference between the two men. Meanwhile, nearby police officers, alerted by concerned citizens, began making their way through the throng of people. Their presence signaled that the situation was about to reach its climax, but not before James delivered one final powerful message. Looking directly at Reginald, James added softly but clearly, "We all have a choice, sir. We can spread anger, or we can choose peace. Today, I choose peace." These words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those who heard them. For many, they served as a poignant reminder of humanity's capacity for compassion, even in the face of hatred. And though Reginald showed no immediate signs of relenting, it was clear that James had already won the moral high ground, earning admiration from strangers and leaving an indelible mark on the day's events. In the days that followed, Corporal James Harrington's story continued to captivate hearts and minds across the globe. What had started as a tense encounter outside Buckingham Palace transformed into something far greater, a symbol of resilience, compassion, and the power of rising above hatred. Schools, community organizations, and even corporations began reaching out, eager to hear directly from the man who had turned a moment of conflict into one of inspiration. Though James initially hesitated to step into the spotlight, he eventually agreed to share his experiences, recognizing the opportunity to spark meaningful conversations. His first speaking engagement took place at a local primary school, where wide-eyed children sat cross-legged on the floor, hanging onto his every word. James spoke simply and sincerely, avoiding grand gestures or dramatic retellings. Instead, he focused on the lessons he hoped they would carry with them: the importance of staying calm in difficult situations, treating others with kindness, and finding strength in vulnerability. "It's okay to feel scared or upset," he told them, kneeling down to their level so they could see eye to eye. "But how we respond to those feelings is what truly matters. We can choose to let anger take over, or we can choose to act with patience and understanding." The room erupted in applause when he finished, and several kids rushed forward to hug him, a gesture that left James visibly moved. As more invitations poured in, James found himself traveling to different cities, sharing his story with diverse audiences. At a youth leadership conference, teenagers bombarded him with questions about how he maintained his composure during the incident. One young woman asked, "Weren't you afraid? How did you stay so calm?" James smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Of course, I felt fear," he admitted. "But fear doesn't have to control us. I remembered my training, focused on what I could control, and trusted that doing the right thing would make a difference, even if it didn't seem like it at the time." His humility resonated deeply with listeners, earning him admiration not just as a hero, but as a relatable human being. People saw themselves in his struggles, The moments of doubt, the sting of prejudice, the quiet determination to rise above it all. In interviews and panel discussions, James emphasized that his actions weren't extraordinary. They were rooted in basic principles of empathy and discipline. "Anyone can do what I did," he often said. "It's not about being fearless. It's about choosing to act with integrity, even when it's hard." The recognition extended beyond public appearances. James received letters and messages from people around the world, many of whom shared personal stories of overcoming adversity inspired by his example. A father wrote to thank him for showing his son that true strength lies in compassion, not aggression. A teacher described using his story in class to teach students about conflict resolution. Even strangers stopped him on the street to express gratitude, their eyes glistening with emotion. Each interaction reinforced James's belief that small acts of courage could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he never imagined. Amidst the accolades, James remained grounded, crediting his upbringing and training for shaping the person he was today. He often reflected on the challenges he'd faced growing up, the taunts, the exclusion, the constant need to prove himself, and how those experiences had taught him resilience. Speaking about them publicly wasn't easy, but he knew it was important. "If sharing my story helps someone else feel less alone," he once remarked, "then it's worth it." While James embraced his role as an advocate for positivity and unity, Reginald Hargrove's journey took a starkly different path. News of his legal troubles served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked anger and prejudice. Some viewed his punishment as a wake-up call, hoping he might emerge from the ordeal with a renewed perspective. Others saw it as justice long overdue. Either way, the contrast between the two men became a topic of widespread discussion, illustrating the divergent paths individuals could take when confronted with their own biases. For James, the entire experience reinforced his commitment to service, not just as a royal guard, but as a beacon of hope in a divided world. As he stood once again outside the palace gates, watching families laugh and tourists marvel at the historic landmark, he felt a profound sense of purpose. This was more than duty. It was an opportunity to remind everyone who crossed his path that grace, dignity, and humanity could shine brightest in the darkest moments. And in doing so, he hoped to leave behind a legacy far greater than any title or honor ever could. Months after the incident, Corporal James Harrington's story had become more than just a viral moment. It was a lasting legacy. His name was no longer associated solely with that day outside Buckingham Palace, but with something far greater: the idea that grace and courage could change perspectives and inspire others to be better versions of themselves. Schools began incorporating his story into anti-bullying campaigns, using it as an example of how to respond to hostility without losing one's humanity. Community leaders referenced him in speeches about overcoming prejudice, urging people to follow his lead by choosing kindness over conflict. James himself embraced this newfound role, though he never sought it. He continued his duties as a royal guard with the same quiet dedication, standing tall at the palace gates day after day. But now, when visitors approached him for photos or asked questions, they weren't just curious tourists. They were individuals inspired by his actions. Parents told their children stories about the brave guard who stayed calm, turning him into a real-life role model. Teachers used his story in classrooms to teach lessons on resilience, empathy, and leadership. Even years later, students would recall those discussions vividly, remembering how one man's poise under pressure showed them what true strength looked like. Beyond public admiration, James also received formal recognition for his actions. The royal family honored him with a special commendation for exemplary service, highlighting not only his professionalism, but also his ability to uphold dignity in the face of adversity. Military officials praised him as a shining example of the values every soldier should strive to embody. Yet through it all, James remained humble. When asked about the accolades during rare interviews, he simply shrugged and said, "I was doing my job. Nothing more, nothing less." To him, the real reward wasn't medals or praise. It was knowing that his actions had made a difference. Reginald Hargrove, on the other hand, faded from the public eye, but not before leaving behind a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred. Legal consequences forced him to confront the impact of his behavior, both personally and socially. During mandatory anger management sessions, Reginald reportedly struggled to accept responsibility, often deflecting blame onto others. However, as time passed, glimpses of reflection began to emerge. In one session, he admitted feeling remorse, not just for the trouble he caused James, but for the way his actions had affected his own life. "I lost everything because I couldn't control my temper," he confessed in a written statement submitted to the court. While some doubted the sincerity of his words, others hoped they marked the beginning of genuine change. The contrast between the two men became a powerful narrative, sparking conversations about accountability and redemption. For many, James represented the best of humanity, someone who chose compassion over retaliation, and Reginald served as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of prejudice and rage. Together, their stories underscored the importance of self-awareness and personal growth, reminding people that while mistakes are inevitable, learning from them is essential. As years went by, James continued to serve with distinction, eventually mentoring younger recruits who looked up to him as a mentor and guide. He taught them not only the technical skills required for the job, but also the softer lessons he learned along the way: how to stay calm under pressure, how to treat everyone with respect, regardless of differences, and how to lead by example. Many of these recruits went on to share his teachings with others, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. Even in retirement, James's influence endured. He wrote a memoir titled Guardian of Grace, recounting his experiences and offering advice for navigating life's challenges with courage and integrity. Proceeds from the book went toward charities supporting mental health awareness and anti-discrimination initiatives. Readers described the memoir as heartfelt and relatable, filled with wisdom that transcended cultural and generational boundaries. Looking back on his life, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He hadn't set out to become a symbol of hope or resilience. He had simply tried to live according to his principles, and yet, in doing so, he had touched countless lives, proving that even in the smallest acts of bravery, there lies the potential to inspire greatness in others. As he walked through the streets of London one crisp autumn morning, now a civilian enjoying the fruits of a life well lived, he paused briefly outside the palace gates. Watching the new generation of guards take their posts, he smiled quietly to himself. The world had changed since that fateful day, but the lessons it had taught remained.